Hi, and welcome to the Orality and Sport Training. My name is Matthew Meng, and I'm a missionary with Operation Mobilization. Now, before we start, I want to ask you a question. Do you have a desire to make disciples who make disciples? Do you want to see your communities in our North American region impacted by the gospel? What if I were to tell you that there's a strategy that has the power to engage your entire community all at once? That has the ability to cross barriers like cultural barriers, language barriers, social and political barriers. A strategy that's been proven to be effective the world over. That is the power of sport ministry, especially when it's been combined with oral strategies. Now, my hope is that through this training, you'll begin to consider how could sport, fitness, or play be a catalyst within your community for the gospel. Now, let me introduce myself a little bit better. My name is Matthew Meng, as I said, and I'm a missionary with Operation Mobilization. For the better part of 18 years, my wife Angela and I have been serving in full-time missions, including 9 years spent living overseas in South Africa. Over the past 10 years, I've had the joy of helping to train hundreds of leaders in Africa, South America, and even the US in how to use oral strategies to make disciples. Currently, we're based in the US just outside of Atlanta, and I help oversee leadership development and training for OM SportsLink internationally. SportsLink is busy right now making disciples on about 132 sport fields in 36 countries, and 46 of our fields are among the least reached. Now, one thing I've learned in my years of training is that learning is something best done in community. In fact, there's a saying in Africa that I love, and it says, if you want to go fast, go alone. But if you want to go far, go together. So if you're watching this alone, I want to challenge you. Pause the video right now. Go and find someone to watch this training with you. Whether it's your spouse, whether it's a coworker, or just someone standing next to you wherever you're at. Invite them to join you, and then let's continue. So now let's start with a few questions. What's your community like? As you think about it, where do people gather socially? How many schools or parks or gyms or churches are in your community? What are the ages and cultural differences? What languages are spoken? If there are churches, how many are there? Or how active are they in engaging the community in disciple-making efforts? Do they often work together in partnership with other churches, or do they work alone by themselves? What are some of the felt needs as you see them, or challenges that people face? Are they job struggles, or homelessness, or family issues? Maybe there's substance abuse or poor health. What are the things that need to change within your community? Now, as you begin to get a picture and a better idea of what your community's like, I want you to ask this question. How could sport, fitness, or play be a catalyst for change? Take some time and talk about this in your group or with your team or whoever you're there with. So how was that exercise? Do you feel like you have a better understanding and picture of your community? Now, whether this was the first time or whether you've done this multiple times, I encourage you to continue to do it over and over again so that you have a good feel for the people that you're trying to reach out to. But with that picture in mind, let me share with you a story about two coaches in Africa who used soccer and storytelling to change their community. Just outside Kabwe, Zambia, there's a township called Makalulu. Now, Makalulu has about 90,000 people living in it. 26% of them are HIV or AIDS positive. 1 in 4 kids is an orphan. About 80% of the children can't attend school, and 70% of the population can't read or write. In the midst of all these challenges, 2 coaches decided to try and make a difference using the sport they love and the Bible stories they had learned. they began meeting regularly with a small group of kids. Each day or each week, they would practice soccer skills and then share a Bible story. And they would teach the kids how to apply the spiritual principles that they would learn from the stories, both in their soccer, but then at home. It wasn't long before there was more kids showing up, and they were seeing growth in that way, but they began seeing growth in another way. And it started when the kids first got the idea from the story of creation. You see, they began to learn that God created everything, and he loved his creation. And they wanted to express to God how thankful they were and how grateful they were for creating everything. So they decided together that they were going to go home, and each one, as a means of thanking God for his creation, they were going to clean up their gardens and their yards. So they went home that week, and each one of them picked up all the trash, straightened up the garden, pulled all the weeds, and basically just made everything look nice in their yards. They realized quickly that it didn't take long to do that, and it was pretty easy to maintain it. So before long, they wanted to do more. They decided, well, why don't we go to our neighbor's house and do the same thing? And since most of them lived on the same street, they began working together in this. And before long, the change was visible. In fact, the coaches were saying that they used to bring people in, and they were amazed because they would be walking through the streets of Makalulu, and everywhere you looked, there was trash and rubbish and garbage, and it looked horrible until you got to this one street. And the change was so drastic that no one could believe it. But you would look from one end to the other, and every house and every garden was neatly maintained and kept, and the streets were clean. And it was because of these kids. Well, the parents began to take notice. And it wasn't just that their yards were now clean, but they began to see that their kids were more obedient. They were trying harder in school. They weren't fighting as much with their siblings at home. They weren't getting into trouble as frequently. So one day, the parents showed up at the practice and asked the coaches, "What are you doing to our kids?" And so the coaches said simply, "Well, we're playing soccer and we're sharing Bible stories. Would you like to hear some of these stories?" The parents said yes, and so they started coming on a weekly basis. And the coaches began to share the Bible stories with the parents. And before long, whole families were becoming followers of Jesus. And were sharing with their extended families and with their friends and with people in the marketplace. And radical change was taking place. Now, from the beginning of that first two coaches setting out with just a few kids to now, they've grown to have a whole team of coaches taking care of over 700 kids. And even some of the coaches that they have now are some of those original kids that they began working with. You're seeing generational multiplication and growth. Now, as you think about this story in the community of Makalulu, in what ways are there similarities between your community? What ways do you think they're different? What's one thing you can learn from this story, and how will you seek to apply it this week in your current context? I want you to take a few minutes and talk about that in your group or with your team. And then let's continue. Now, you might be saying to yourself, "Matt, that's amazing, but that's Africa. That'll never work in our American Western context." Or you might be saying, "I don't actually work with youth or kids. How is that going to fit my context where I'm working with primarily adults?" Well, let me share another story with you from some sports leaders down in Texas. Now, back in 2010, around the time of the World Cup in South Africa, Soccer World Cup, by the way, there was a group of sports leaders that had taken some of the refugees they were working with out to Galveston to play soccer. Now, what they had noticed about the communities that they were ministering to is, first of all, even though they all shared similar challenges of needing to learn a new language, needing to find work in a new country, needing to adapt to a new culture and situation. What wasn't happening was people weren't bridging out from their own culture or nation or community. So you had all these people that were there right next to each other, but no one was helping one another with the challenges that they were facing. Something else that they noticed was that the churches in Houston weren't working together either. So everyone was active trying to reach refugees, but no one was doing it together. So as they were out there that day in Galveston playing soccer on the beach, a thought occurred to the team. They said to themselves, what if we could do our own World Cup? That idea birthed a partnership between 17 churches and nonprofit organizations. Later in 2010, they launched the first Community Cup, or Cup of Nations. They had 16 national teams show up from these refugee communities. The players ranged in age from being teens all the way up to the 20s and 30s. They had involvement from local government agencies and officials. They had community involvement from the churches and from the refugee communities themselves. And through it, there was multiple disciple groups that were started, discovery Bible studies all around the areas where these refugees were living. Now, the hope was eventually it would lead to church plants and multiplication of disciples. From that point till now, there's been over 26 community cups that have been run within the North American region, from places to St. Louis, Atlanta, Houston, Seattle, and all around. They've had over 71 nations participate in Community Cup. And in fact, Community Cup is now a global strategy, one that's been used all around the world to impact communities. Now, as you think about this story, did you notice how not only did this strategy help to bring together churches and ministries in partnering for disciple making, but it united communities across cultural and language barriers? So how might this or some similar sports ministry strategy help you in your community? Take a few minutes and process this together with your group or your team. Now, hopefully by this point, you're beginning to see how powerful sports ministry can be in bringing people together and producing change in a community. But maybe you're saying to yourself, Matt, this is great and all, but we've tried sport ministry, and it doesn't seem to lead to the kind of multiplication that your stories imply. Well, let me share a bit more about that team down in Houston and what they learned in their experiences. Now, you'll recall I said that after the first event in 2010, they started several Discovery Bible Study groups. And the goal was that it would lead to church planting. But the problem was they were using the same old methods and tools that they were trained with and taught with that were all literate. So all of their Discovery Bible Study groups were heavy on reading, heavy on writing, and a lot of study. And what they found was that as excited as people were when they came to the group, they just couldn't stick with it. This was especially true of the youth, but the adults struggled as well. And over time, people just stopped coming. They didn't share with their families or with their community, and so there wasn't multiplication beyond the team themselves. Oftentimes, it actually was they would invite the team to come and share the stories rather than them going by themselves to share what they were learning in these Bible studies. Now, at some point, one of the sports leaders was introduced to the idea of orality and oral learners. And so they began implementing some of the things that they were learning. They began telling stories and creating dialogue and discussion. The change was almost immediate. People began sharing the stories with their friends and with their families and with their coworkers. They began multiplying. They began going out and reproducing those Discovery Bible studies. They saw so much fruit and growth from it that now all of their groups that are started in Houston through the Community Cup are oral. In fact, in this last year alone, they had 24 Discovery Bible studies. Every single one of them was done orally. And through it, they've had 3 churches planted just in this last year. So let me ask you this question. As you think about your community, how could applying oral strategies to your disciple-making efforts help with growth and multiplication? What are some of the benefits of using oral strategies that you can see from this story in Houston? Do you have any reservations about using oral strategies? Discuss these questions together with your group and your team, and then we'll continue. Now, some of the questions that I've run into when I'm doing training on how to employ oral strategies is, Matt, this all sounds great, but storytelling's kind of basic, isn't it? I mean, how do we really study the Bible deeply? How do you keep heresies from proliferating when you're going and sharing stories? Now, these are all important and valid questions, and they deserve answers. To the first question, let me ask you this. What did Jesus do? Consider how many times when Jesus was teaching, he used stories and parables. In fact, Matthew 13:34 states that he did not say anything to them without a parable. That's an amazing thought. This is Jesus, God in the flesh, the disciple maker of all disciple makers. And storytelling was his main method for teaching and discipling his followers. What does that say to us about the power of stories, especially stories from the Bible? Now, the second question says, how do we really study the Bible using oral methodology? Well, let me explain it with a little bit of a basketball analogy. I love basketball. I think it's a great sport. What's the most important thing when you're playing basketball? It's to score more points than your opponent, right? Well, how do you do that? You shoot the ball into the hoop. Does it matter whether it's with your right hand or your left hand? I could sit and shoot all day with my right hand and never take a shot with my left hand. It doesn't matter, right? The ball's going in the hoop. At the end of the day, the goal is to get the ball in the hoop as consistently and as effectively as possible. The truth is, it's the same when we're studying the Bible. If our goal is for people to be able to take the word, to learn it, understand it, and apply it to their lives, then the method we use to get there doesn't really matter at the end of the day, as long as we're effectively getting to that goal on a consistent basis. Now, if you use the example of the right hand versus left hand, so I'm right-handed. Coincidentally, the majority of the world, the same percentage of people that are right-handed, are oral learners. Now, when I played basketball, I learned to shoot with my left hand. It was important for me to be able to shoot with both. In fact, there were situations where I needed to be able to shoot with my left hand in order to make shots. But no matter how comfortable or how confident I got shooting with my left hand, it didn't change the fact that at the end of the day, I was right-handed. And I would always be most effective shooting with my right hand. In the same way, an oral learner, there's value in learning literacy and literacy skills. It can help us come to some conclusions that we wouldn't find otherwise. Now, the reality is, no matter how good I get at shooting with my right hand, or how good I get at shooting with my left hand, I should say, because I'm a right-hander, I will never become left-handed. In the same way, for an oral learner, learning literacy skill is valuable, but no matter how skilled or proficient they become, they'll never not be an oral learner. I'm proof of this. I grew up with a mom who was an English teacher, a sister who was an English major, and 2 other sisters who just love to correct my grammar. I am very skilled when it comes to literacy, reading, writing, and doing a whole lot of different things. However, I'm still an oral learner at heart. I still love to learn by working in a group, talking, dialoguing back and forth. It's true the world over. And if we want to be effective at studying the Word or helping oral learners study the Word, then we need to use the methodologies and the means that are going to be most effective in doing that. So, oral learning for oral learners, or literacy for more literate learners. So, if our goal is the apprehension and application of Scripture to our lives, then we need to use and encourage people to use the methods or hand that they're going to be most effective with. Now, this might fly in the face of some of our paradigms here in the West, such as literacy is best. But if it's something that we need to grapple with, if we're going to be able to reach the 3 billion people in the world that still haven't heard the gospel. Now, the last question. This is one I get asked all the time. How do you prevent heresies? And the reality is this. We'll go back to the very beginning of what I said at the start of this video. In an oral setting, learning is done in community. And with that comes accountability. This means built into the whole process is everyone holding each other accountable to whatever the standard is that's set. Now, if we start off from the get-go saying, look, these stories that I'm sharing, they're not my stories. This is God's word. Therefore, I'm not going to change it. I'm not going to add to it my own opinions, my own ideas. I'm going to share with you the truth of God's word. If you do that, then from the get-go, the group together will hold one another accountable to that standard. It's kind of like in basketball. There's a rule book that everyone has to play by. You can't just make up your own rules and decide, well, today I can bounce the ball with both hands and it's not a double dribble. We have to all abide by the rule book. Well, for an oral learner, the rule book isn't the printed text. The rule book is the audio. So if you have a good, solid audio Bible that's been recorded well, it becomes the standard for oral learners. And when you're in a group, I can't deviate from that standard. Just like in basketball, I can't fudge the rules and make it be what I want it to be. In the same way, as we approach the Word, if we emphasize that the Word is our standard, not our ideas, not what we think about it, but the Word itself becomes the standard, the group will hold that, and they will learn faster and better than normally we learn through literate means. Now, one other thing that I want to point out, and it's kind of an irony. Majority of heresies that we hear about in the world today, they've come through normal literate practices. From people coming and sitting in the church, listening to a learned pastor or preacher teaching, and teaching something that's completely off. But because they're so trained to trust what the pastor is saying, they don't go back and question it. Whereas when you dialogue together and talk about it in an oral setting, it quickly becomes apparent if someone comes with an idea or a concept that's not actually in the text or in the story itself. So, hopefully that answered some of your questions. If you have others, I'd love to dialogue further on it. So, I want to pause. I want to stop here. I hope that you've enjoyed this training, and I'd love to hear from you. If you have questions, or maybe you'd like to discuss further, please feel free to email me. The email should be listed on the video here below. Also, if you'd like to learn more about how to use sport, fitness, or play as a disciple-making strategy within your community, I encourage you to go and check out www.readysetgo.world. This website is a library of tools and resources that have been created by sports leaders from around the globe who are devoted to making disciples for Christ in the world of sport and play. The resources are free for you to download and share with anyone you want. You can use it in your ministry however you feel fit. The only thing we ask is that you don't try to charge for them. If you would like to connect with others who are actively making disciples in the world of sport and play here in North America, contact me. I'd love to get you connected. Thanks again for taking the time to watch. Maybe I'll see you on a sports field somewhere soon. Blessings.